I'm your host, David, and welcome to the inaugural episode of The Cold War, an exploration of the 44-year conflict that shaped the world we live in. With the unconditional surrender of Germany on May 8, 1945, 6 years of war in Europe came to a close. The Axis powers, seemingly unstoppable in 1939 and 1940, had been smashed by the combined military and economic weight of the Allied powers. Although outlines had been laid regarding what post-war Europe would look like, no final decisions had been made which took into account the situation on the ground at the time of this surrender. The Allies themselves were a global force, which included up to 27 different countries by the time of the German surrender. Not all of these countries were equal members, and the alliance was dominated by the so-called Big Four: the United States, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. At the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, US President Franklin Roosevelt, UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin had agreed to meet again shortly after the defeat of Germany in order to finalize borders in post-war Europe, as well as discuss and resolve other outstanding matters, including how Germany was to be treated. The German city of Potsdam, a mere 24 kilometers from war-ravaged central Berlin, was selected to host this meeting, largely in part because it was relatively unscathed by the war, and it was easy to secure and ensure the safety of the attendees. As Potsdam was in the Soviet zone of occupation, they acted as the hosts, and the Cecilienhof was refurbished to provide accommodation for the leaders and their staff. Churchill was initially against any meeting being held in the Soviet zone, but Stalin and Harry Truman, who would become US president after the death of President Roosevelt in April, had already agreed to meet near Berlin, and Churchill reluctantly acquiesced to the location. As one of the primary goals of the planned meeting between the leaders was to finalize the map of post-war Europe, it is critically important to understand what the map looked like in May of 1945. The Red Army occupied Central and Eastern Europe, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, independent countries during the interwar period, were firmly under the control of the Soviet Union. Red Army troops, combat-hardened, well-supplied, and highly capable, were positioned in all of these countries, seemingly poised to continue their offensive into Western Europe. Facing them, troops from the United States, Great Britain, and the Commonwealth, France, and other Allied nations occupied France and Italy, and the western half of Germany, including Bavaria and Western Austria. Denmark had been occupied by British troops, while Norway had been liberated by a combined force of Norwegians and Allied troops, as well as Soviet troops in the northern Finnmark. In the Balkans and southern Europe, Yugoslavia was under the control of Josip Broz Tito and his partisan forces, while Albania was under the control of Enver Hoxha and his communist forces. Further south in Greece was sliding towards civil war, as royalist forces supported by Great Britain were lining up against communist forces supported by the Yugoslav communists. In the Pacific, the war continued, although Allied progress was substantial, with Okinawa and Iwo Jima now firmly in American hands. The Soviet Union was preparing to enter the Pacific War, honoring its agreement from the Yalta Conference to declare war on Japan within 3 months of the defeat of Germany. It had been decided that the Soviet Union would be responsible for attacking the Japanese in Manchuria, the Sakhalin and Kuril Islands, and would be responsible for the invasion of the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido. Now that we have an overview of the geographic situation, the relationships between the leaders of the Big Three are crucial to understanding the results of the Potsdam Conference and the events that occurred afterwards. Stalin entered the Potsdam Conference at the peak of his power and influence. He had led the Soviet Union from the brink of disastrous defeat in 1941 to the pinnacle of victory in its war against Nazi Germany. With Soviet military power now extending well into Europe, he was maneuvering to solidify and consolidate that power on a permanent basis, despite pledges not to do so. There was a desire to create a buffer between the West and the Soviet Union to prevent fighting on Soviet territory. This was in response to the devastating losses and damage sustained in the war against Germany. Stalin himself had a reputation as being a clever strategist an adept politician, being simultaneously charming and ruthless, with a large dose of paranoia overlaid over all of these things. A keen judge of character, he was quick to exploit weakness and play opponents against each other in order to maximize the situation for his own benefit. Harry Truman had assumed the role of president only in April of 1945, after the death of Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt, through his meetings and dealings with Stalin in the years leading up to his death, felt quite sympathetic to him and believed him to be a well-intentioned leader. He is quoted at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. "I just have a hunch that Stalin doesn't want anything but security for his country, and I think that if I give him everything I possibly can and ask nothing from him in return, noblesse oblige, he wouldn't try to annex anything and will work for a world of democracy and peace." As such, US policy towards the Soviet Union under FDR was very cordial. Truman, a moderate Democrat from Missouri, found himself thrust into the presidency and had to quickly orient himself in the world of international relations. He had a reputation as a modest yet efficient, no-nonsense leader. He did not agree with Roosevelt's assessment of Stalin and his intentions, and was highly suspicious of communism and its threat to the United States and to democracy. He saw the Red Army occupation of much of Eastern Europe not as a temporary action by the Soviet Union, but one which would be permanent as the Soviets expanded their sphere of influence. He was also fearful of the level of communist sympathy that existed in Germany, France, Italy, and even the UK, which he felt that Stalin would try to exploit to further Soviet influence. Winston Churchill had always been a strong anti-communist and was highly suspicious of Stalin and his intentions. Churchill, a pragmatist at the end of the day, knew that some concessions would have to be made given the position of strength that the Soviets held. At a 1944 meeting in Moscow between the two leaders, verbal concessions had already been given regarding Soviet influence in Romania in exchange for a pledge of non-interference in Greece. Churchill started the Potsdam Conference with this approach still in mind, trying to ensure that some areas remained in the Western sphere of influence at the expense of others. Of major significance in the United Kingdom was the general election held on July 5th, whose results were being delayed until later in July to allow for the inclusion of overseas ballots being cast by members of the armed forces. The results were announced on July 26th during the conference itself, and to the surprise of many, Churchill had lost to the Labour Party led by Clement Attlee. Attlee at the time had a desire to work with Stalin and felt that challenging him too much would push Moscow away and risk a new conflict. Attlee, however, was not considered by even himself or others as a foreign policy expert and relied on his foreign secretary, Ernest Bevin, for advice and counsel. Bevin was a firm anti-communist who was extremely wary of the Soviet Union, Stalin, and their intentions in Europe. Like at Yalta, France was not invited to participate at the Potsdam Conference. Although it had been agreed that France would be an equal member of the Allied Control Council, the body that would oversee the occupation of Germany, Charles de Gaulle, the de facto French leader, had a poor working relationship with Roosevelt. There had already been disputes between the French and the Americans over the zone of occupation, and neither side saw eye to eye on the future of French Indochina. Churchill sided with the Americans, believing the French would be more at odds and a hindrance to achieving the already agreed-upon goals of the conference. De Gaulle took this personally, setting France on a divergent path, weakening the unity of the Allies in the West. So, although the Potsdam Conference is considered the last in a series of wartime conferences between the leaders of the major Allied powers, it does stand alone in that two of the three leaders were different from prior meetings. The United Kingdom and the United States, already used to working closely together as a result of joint military action during the war, were led by men who were quite cautious of the Soviet leader and his intentions. Lines, however informal, were starting to form. Since at least 1943, the question of how post-war Germany would be handled was being asked in the corridors of power. As Germany was the major protagonist in two world wars in the space of 30 years, there was a common desire that the German capacity to wage war be hamstrung. Over the course of 1944, the US Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, put together a proposal, Suggested Post-Surrender Program for Germany, which has generally become known as the Morgenthau Plan. In it, he called for 1. The demilitarization of Germany, including its armed forces, as well as the destruction and removal of the armaments industry or industries considered necessary to militarization. 2. The partition of Germany into 2 separate states, the secession of part of East Prussia and Silesia to Poland, the secession of the Saar and the territory between the Rhine and Moselle to France. Austria was to be returned to its pre-1938 borders, and the Ruhr Valley was to be made into an internationally controlled zone with special regulatory rules as outlined in point number 3. Point number 3. The Ruhr was to be stripped of any and all remaining industrial capacity, including its manufacturing and mining, and its population was to be widely dispersed so as to prevent capacity for reindustrialization. Point number 4. Ongoing reparations would not be demanded from the Allies, but would instead be taken in the form of industrial material and territory. Effectively, the Morgenthau Plan called for the pastoralization of a divided Germany, returning it to an agrarian state with no ability to go to war. At the Second Quebec Conference between Roosevelt and Churchill, held in September of 1944, the concepts of the Morgenthau Plan were agreed on except for the plan to divide Germany. Although Roosevelt felt strongly that Germany should be severely punished, Churchill was reluctant, fearing that the United Kingdom would be left responsible for looking after an incapacitated German state. If Germany was de-industrialized and made into a wholly pastoral state, it was estimated there would not be enough food and resources for upwards of 40% of the population. This would mean that the occupying forces would be responsible for feeding those people or responsible for letting them starve. Neither result was palatable. The United States and Great Britain both, however, knew that the Soviet Union was highly likely to move forward with stripping everything and anything they could from their zone of occupation. This belief was confirmed in the weeks and months after the German surrender, as Allied troops took over their zones of occupation in Berlin. They witnessed entire factories being dismantled and loaded on trains heading east. In fact, the Red Army was not only taking machinery and raw materials, but were taking everything they could, including, in some cases, the plumbing and wiring from buildings. It was becoming apparent that a divided Germany may be inevitable. The leaders of the three powers began to arrive at the Cecilienhof in the days leading up to the conference start on July 17th. Both Truman and Churchill took the time to tour Berlin, witnessing the after effects of the Allied air campaign, as well as the Red Army battle to take the city. It also allowed them to see the Germans and various foreign workers that had been brought to Germany to work under the Third Reich. These were the people whose futures they were meeting to decide. It's difficult to estimate the direct effect this may have had, but the destitution Churchill and Truman would have witnessed would likely have had some softening impact on the decisions they would make regarding their future. The conference itself was composed of various plenary sessions and banquets where the shape of post-war Europe was being decided. The dinners were lavish and the drinks and toasts were plentiful. The major talking points included the administration of post-war Germany, including demilitarization, denazification, and democratization. Much time was taken in how to shape the borders of post-war Europe, especially regarding Poland and the German territories in the east. This included how to deal with and manage ethnic minorities, especially Germans, in occupied countries. Finalizing the reparation schemes also became a major point, especially as the Allies could already see the Soviets moving ahead with taking what they felt was their share. There was also time taken to discuss how and when the Soviet Union would get involved in the war against Japan. So now that we know the situation at the start of the conference, how did all this play out? What were the contentious points? And what was each side trying to accomplish? And most importantly, what was the result and effect of the conference? We will continue talking about Potsdam soon, so please be sure to hit subscribe as we at the Cold War plan to bring you more episodes explaining the creation of new global institutions, the ideologies behind the participants, as well as life in the nations involved. We rely on our patrons to create these videos, so consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is the Cold War channel, and we will catch you on the next one.